Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about trophic structure within a community. And I also want to bring up some really cool conversation about species that are particularly important in a community, and they're called dominant species and keystone species. And so let's get into this conversation, shall we? So, trophic structure, I think most of us are familiar with trophic structure. It's kind of an elementary idea, but it's rather important. Trophic meaning feeding. And so that in a community, there's feeding relationships between the organisms. And it all sort of starts with where the food begins, which is the autotrophs, the ones that are photosynthesizing, for example, this juicy fig right here. So plants are receiving sunlight in the leaves and they're producing sugars like glucose, and then those are stored. And herbivores, which are primary consumers, are coming along and eating this. And then a carnivore, something that eats an herbivore, could be a secondary consumer, and that's eating that, and that's what we call the food chain. So it's kind of basic in that the producer is being eaten by the herbivore, which is a primary consumer, and then that's being eaten by the secondary consumer, which is a carnivore or a meat eater. And so this constitutes a food chain. So the autotrophic, and then these are considered to be heterotrophic, and this is a primary consumer, secondary consumer. I think most of you are familiar with that. And so what's interesting about a food chain is not only that it's important, is that what happens is that sometimes it can be really quite restricted. In other words, it really is kind of a chain where A, B, and C link together, and it's really like, for example, let me give you two examples of that. The ladybug, for example, really loves this one type of aphid. And so what you got here is the producer, then you have the herbivore, and then you have the consumer. And these three are always linked together in a food chain. And then you get like things like the panda. The panda bear is pretty, I don't know, finicky is a word, in that it really likes to eat it's a vegetarian, really likes to eat the bamboo. And so you get these specific relationships called food chains. But the truth is, and you know this, that in reality, the situation in a community is a lot more complex. Like, for example, like several species at a trophic level can be competing for food with other species on its own level. In other words, like, for example, here's the first trophic level here. In the second trophic level, there's a lot of competition for that. And so there's many different kinds of relationships that are occurring. And so also on the levels up, you can get different kinds of predators that are competing. And so it's very complex on each of these trophic levels and what's happening ultimately as you move up from the primary to secondary to tertiary and quaternary. So there's all kinds of interrelationships happening. They just don't eat one thing. Like, in other words, if your favorite food's not around, you're going to switch to something else and then switch to something else. And so, consequently, a more accurate description of these trophic levels is something that we like to call a food web. And within the web, you could study things like food chains. But there's many cross links forming what we like to call a web. Like, for example, an insect can be eaten by a bird, but it could also be eaten by a toad. And so there's many kinds of relationships that will happen. And so what's interesting about this and why we would even be discussing it is we always like to say, like, well, what would happen if we were to remove the wolf from the food web? And that's part of our conversation. But I want you to think about that. So, it's like, well, why would we do that? Well, the wolf is kind of dangerous. And again, if you're living in the same range of a wolf, things are a little bit different. I mean, most of us live in a city, but if you were living in sort of a rural environment, there was wolves walking around. It's not, the wolf is not necessarily friendly. And not only that, it might be eating your pets, or it could be eating your cattle and that sort of thing. They're kind of troublesome. So say we're out there shooting them, and we're eliminating this. And so if you remove an organism from the web, what effect does it have on the other organisms? It's going to have an effect, I can just tell you, but there's more to this. It's going to have an effect on whatever is eating that. So in other words, the predator is going to be disturbed. And then also the prey is going to be disturbed. You're like, God, the prey is going to love it. No more wolves, beep, beep, the witch is dead. Be careful, because all these organisms can get out of balance. And so we'll talk more about that. So again, this is somewhat basic, but again, basic doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't as important. And so, we talk about these chains right here and these different levels. So just to make sure, the level 1 is where energy is coming in from the sun. And so we have these primary producers. We can have it in the water and also in the land. So here's a land plant, and over here in the water we have these phytoplankton. And then we have zooplankton, and then we have the carnivore, which is the secondary, and then the tertiary and the quaternary. And then we, likewise on the land, we can move all the way up this way. So all of these guys right here are consumers, and this is a producer. We could say that these are heterotrophic, and this is autotrophic. We can do this. But here's a question, sometimes these food chains are not as lengthy as this. Sometimes there's only like 3 links in the chain. What determines this? Well, it all has to do with the abundance of primary producers. If the primary producers, in other words, if there's not a lot of primary productivity, it's not going to be able to sustain these higher level consumers. And I can just give you, this is going to come up in another conversation, but let me just sort of give you a little insight to this. Like, for example, I don't know, you could just say, like, I don't know, the energy efficiency is not very good as you move up. So I don't know if you recall this somewhere, but it's usually 10%. In other words, the organic material, like the sugars, the organic carbon-containing compounds in the plant, only 10% of it is going to make up the organic material in the next level up. And so there's a loss. Like, I don't know, for example, just throw out some numbers. If there's 100 kilograms right there in terms of biomass, that's a unit of mass. There's 100 kilograms. You're going to lose 90% on the next level up, and you're going to get 10 kilograms up here, and then you're going to get 1 kilogram. And so do you see how there needs to be a lot more grasshoppers for these rodents to be able to survive? And so if you have lots of primary producers, a big base, then you can have more and then more and more and more. Okay? So one of the things, I know it's kind of weird because you're like, oh, that's very obvious, but it's like, see orca up here, the killer whale? You're like, well, the real reason that an environment will have killer whales is that there's lots of phytoplankton. And so you're like, well, why is there a lot of phytoplankton? Well, there must be a lot of nutrient in the water. That's one thing. So maybe a lot of upwelling. So that's something of consideration. So usually these food chains are, again, this is a food chain, but again, the food web is more realistic. In other words, there's more organisms on each of these trophic levels, and they're eating different things. They're competing, and they're fighting over the food, and you can have a lot of diversity. And so, who eats who in the community? These are diagrammed in what we'd like to call a food web, and they're very intricate. And so one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning of the video that's kind of an extension of this conversation, these two things are really linked, is I want to bring up the idea of there's dominant species and keystone species, and these particular species play really important regulatory effects on the whole community structure, meaning like the biodiversity of the community. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, again, here in this redwood forest, you could say that, the fact that I'm even calling it a redwood forest sort of speaks to the fact that the redwood tree is the dominant species, which means that it's of maybe the highest abundance in biomass in the area. But if we were to log it, if we were to remove the redwood tree, what happens is there's a change in the entire community structure. In other words, there's a lot of organisms that need the tree they live in the tree, or there's organisms that will be affected by the loss of the forest. And so that's what we mean by a dominant species. And so I'm going to bring up an example of this toucan. I don't know if you're familiar with the toucan. It's not something that we see all the time, but it certainly lives in South America. And once upon a time, it was pretty pretty abundant in like countries like Brazil and tropical Brazil. And so I'm going to sort of yield from discussing what I'm going to say about the toucan and actually bring up. I found this really interesting story about the toucan on NPR, and so I'm going to let you listen to this. It's a cool story.
It's Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Renee Montaigne. Brazil is a paradise for birds. You're hearing some now. It's a country with more than 1,700 species, among them the colorful toucan, a bird with an almost comically giant bill that can be half as long as its body. There are lots of different kinds of toucan, red-breasted, channel-billed, keel-billed, each with its own color scheme and distinctive call. Unfortunately, as more humans have moved into Brazil's forests, the number of toucans has dwindled. And as NPR's Christopher Joyce reports, scientists now notice that the downfall of the toucan has created an unexpected evolutionary change in the forests.
Walking through the Atlantic coastal forests of Brazil in the morning is like eavesdropping on a toucan symphony. Each produces its own unique sound to cut through the auditory clutter. But over the past century, the toucans have been disappearing. Hunting, farming, logging, it's all taken a big toll on toucans. With fewer and fewer birds, the toucan symphony is down to a murmur. They're just about gone from many parts of the forest. And it appears that their disappearance kick-started a whole evolutionary change in the forest itself, particularly in its palm trees. According to research in the journal Science, this is what happened. The dominant palm tree depends on birds to eat its fruit and then defecate the seed somewhere, so it will germinate and grow a new tree. Mauro Galetti is a biologist at the Estadual Paulista University in Brazil. He says toucans play a big part in this reproductive process.
These large birds, they have an extremely important role in the forest, not only because they disperse seeds, but because they disperse large seeds.
The largest palm seeds, some the size of marbles, are too big for most birds to eat, except for those big-mouthed toucans. So, as the toucans disappeared, the palms that made big seeds were out of luck, no seed dispersers. Meanwhile, the palms that were genetically disposed to make small seeds did just fine. In fact, they thrived and started to dominate the forest.
The extinction of large birds changed the evolution of this palm.
Now, humans have always been messing with nature. When we cut down forests or prairie or when we overhunt, we change the mix of plants and animals. But in this case, humans actually altered the genetic makeup of a wild palm tree population in just a century by accident. So what happens if these small seed palms eventually take over? Well, it turns out that smaller seeds aren't so good. They dry up and die faster in hot, dry weather. And scientists predict that climate change will make parts of Brazil hotter and drier. So much so that these palms could be in trouble.
The effects on the forest can be quite dramatic because several animal species rely on this palm for food.
About 60 species of animals, in fact. So the take-home message is, as the toucan goes, so goes the forest. Christopher Joyce, NPR News.
And our toucan vocalizations came from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Macaulay Library.
So I hope you enjoyed that. I didn't want to tell the story myself because it's I think it's better coming from the source. I hope you enjoyed that. Well, again, it really illustrates what we're talking about in this video, which is, again, just to reiterate it, the loss of the toucan means that the large seeds are not getting dispersed because it's the toucan that's dispersing it. And so as a result, it's directional selection toward the small seed palms. And as the podcast suggests, the small seed palm isn't very good because it dries up. It's the larger one's a little bit better. And so as a result of it, the palm tree isn't going to be doing well. And as the palm tree goes, literally goes, the loss of the palm tree, it's the loss of what we'd call a keystone species, because the palm tree is a big home. It's like a hotel for all of, remember in the podcast it said for about 60 different species. And so the loss of the keystone species, which is the palm, is going to result in the loss of numerous other species. And so this is a priority for conservation biologists who are trying to maintain species diversity. We have to pay attention to what are the keystone species. In other words, the palms. And so what happens is there's a massive reduction. And so there's like what we call a cascade of reduced biodiversity. So that's kind of brutal. Now, kind of the opposite of that is like we have these organisms like, I don't know if you recognize these guys, these are beavers. And what they can do is they're called ecosystem engineers. And so by building dams, what happens is you get all these twigs. It's quite remarkable if you've actually seen this before. And again, if you live next to a creek, you don't want this because the water's going to swell up and it's going to flood and you're going to be upset about that. But the truth is, this creates, when it flooding creates wetlands, and the wetland allows for a lot more insects and bugs and things, which then encourages more birds to come to an area. And so the beaver actually helps to create species diversity. So the more beavers, the better. But it depends on your outlook, sort of like the wolves. And speaking of wolves, they're considered to be top predators, but they're also considered to be keystone species. And so sometimes they're referred to as a keystone predator, but they're keystone species. Like a keystone species would be the palm, but a palm is not a predator. So this is a keystone species that happens to be a predator. And a lot of top predators happen to be keystone for this reason. If you eliminate the top predator, what happens is you dramatically change the whole community biodiversity. And so again, in some places, I'll just go with the gray wolf. The gray wolf has been hunted by people to a point where it's at not only endangered, but it's extinct in certain regions. Again, humans and wolves don't get along very well. And so as a result, and we've looked at this, is when there's no more wolves in an area, the deer, which is the direct prey of the wolf, just explodes in numbers because there's no regulatory mechanism there. And so the deer, and so you're like, yay, I like deer. This is a good thing. Not necessarily, because when the deer get out of hand, they start to overgraze the habitat. And you're like, oh, whatever. No, not whatever, because they're eliminating a lot of the grasses and herbs and shrubs. And so if you eliminate all of that primary productivity and all of those autotrophs, then every other herbivore that's living along with the deer is going to be lacking food, and then you're going to eliminate a lot of herbivore species, which is then going to take down all the carnivore species. And so, again, the loss of the plant means destruction. And so you're going to lose insects, and you're going to reduce plant cover in general if there's a lot of deer grazing. And then you're like, well, even the soil, when there's no grasses, the soil, when it rains, will start to erode. And then that's going to lose all the little species that live in the soil, and you can get a lot of runoff into creeks and actually destroy rivers as a result of this. And you're like, now you've gone too far. No, if you eliminate the wolves, the fish will die. This is what I'm talking about. It's all interrelated. And so when the wolves are critical, they're a keystone predator. And so when we've realized this, we've got to take action. And so now we have to mediate this. We have to put up laws and say, hey, we've got to, door to door. I'm sorry, you can't shoot these wolves anymore. And you're like, I'm going to shoot this wolf if it comes onto my land. That's my land. And it's like, now you're not going to shoot the wolf. It's against the law to shoot the wolf. And so the wolves have not only been you can't hunt them anymore, but they've actually been like inoculated. They've been restored. They've been put back into these ecosystems. It's a reestablishment plan. And so this is pretty interesting. When you look at a map here, you can see this is in light green, this is where they used to live, and then the dark green is where they're living now. And so, what happened to them? They were purposely hunted and trapped. They were poisoned. It was brutal. And so why? Because again, if they're threatening your own children, then you're like, okay, I don't like the wolf, but it's easy for us to talk about it. But in 1973, there was no wolves remaining in a large part of this area, and so we started to see a dramatic reduction in species diversity, and there was trouble. And so we decided to prohibit killing them, and then we started to improve their habitat, protect it, and then reintroduce them. And so check this out, what one might expect us, their population is now increasing and increasing. And so they've now been removed from the endangered list as a result of this. And so the whole community is a lot happier. Easy for me to say. And so a lot of studies have been done, not just on the wolves, but again, a lot of ecological studies looking at keystone species, or in this case, the keystone predator of the tide pool. Now, a lot of experiments on tide pools. Why tide pools? Because it's easy to sit there and observe it in its natural environment. I like to see you go out there and count wolves. I like to see you go out there and study that huge area. Whereas in a tide pool, it's the same thing happening. You got all these different species. You can count them up very easily. You can be like, you just bring out your little key and you're like, okay, there's the mussel and the clam and the limpet, all these guys. And then there's the sea star. So you look at the number of species present in the community. And then you identify who's that top dominant predator. In this case, believe it or not, it's the sea star. You're like, well, like the wolves, you don't have to kill them, but you could actually bring out a bucket and you can actually grab these and remove them and then study the effect. You're like, I'd like to investigate what happens when you eliminate the number of keystone predators. I wonder what that's going to have, what the effect that's going to be, and check it out. This is an experiment that was done over many, many, many years. And so here's the control. This is Piaster is the genus of the sea star. So over here, this is a controlled tide pool. So it was just left. And so you count up the number of species over time. It's pretty consistent. But then in this one tide pool, you remove, sort of like the wolves, you remove the dominant predator and look what happens. It's like all of the species are declining. And like, why are they declining? Because they're a little bit out of whack. Again, sort of like the deer population may have gone really high up, and that actually caused the detriment of other species. And so this is really cool. I mean, it allows you to sort of really examine what's happening in a food web. And so trophic levels are related to keystone predators and dominant species. One more example I find that's very interesting is this is the California sea otter, and it swims out. It's very, very cute mammal, and it's very loved. It has a lot of density in its fur. And so humans are very interested in it, not just because it's cute, but we like to kill it and actually use the pelt for clothing, unfortunately. But as we began to eliminate the number of sea otters, again, the sea otter, I know you don't think of it as a wolf or think of it as the sea star, but in fact it happens to be a keystone predator, which means that what is it eating? It's eating the sea urchin, which is this sort of purpley guy with spines. And so what happens? If you don't have any more sea otters or the numbers go down, that means that the sea urchins are going to rise. And as the sea urchins rise, they're bentha. So in other words, they're living in the bottom of the ocean. So they start cruising around, and they're actually pretty brutal. They're herbivores. They'll go out and they'll start gnawing on the kelp. Now, kelp's a big brown algae, but think of it as like a big tree in the ocean, and it's held on the bottom by this primitive root system called a holdfast. And as the sea urchins get out of control, they start gnawing on that. And how about this? They start eliminating the kelp forest as a result of their numbers. So if you eliminate the kelp forest, now the kelp is, boy, talk about a very important species there. Now that is a keystone species. So you eliminate the kelp forest, and what happens is you eliminate all of the community that thrives in a forest. And so it's really, really detrimental, and all because of the loss of the sea otter. So of course now there's laws protecting the sea otter. Likewise, finally, here's a story like in the tropical rainforest. You know what? As you know, the tropical rainforest is subject to a lot of deforestation. We like to go in there and log it, but there is some restraint because we've identified the fact that even in a tropical forest, some trees are more important than others, as it turns out, and some of the more important ones are these keystone ones. So if you remove them, it involves this extinction cascade that we've been talking about in this video. And so what happens is, what do you suppose an important tree is in the rainforest? And it turns out there's several, but one of the ones I want to talk about is the fruit tree, in particular a fig tree. Now the fig tree has this long fruiting season, and so there's lots of juicy figs for many different animals who live in the tree to eat. And so a lot of different organisms are loving the figs. We love the figs too, but they are a very important resource for many birds and mammal species. So everyone's thriving on it. But if you suddenly cut the fig tree down due to what? Logging, or if there was some sort of introduced fungal disease or whatever brought in again by people, because people could enter in and they're carrying things in their shoes, and they're like introducing an invasive fungus. But nevertheless, if the fig is destroyed, it's going to be a major loss to the birds and mammals that not only eat the fig, but the predators that rely on the fig eaters. And so it's major. And so the overall effect to the food web would be catastrophic. And so how about this? So when a logger's coming into the rainforest and eliminating, they're not allowed to cut down the fig tree. So some of these other trees, you can remove them and it's not so good, but it's not devastating. But if you remove the fig, it's going to be a keystone, and therefore it's going to have a extinction cascade, and it'll be a permanent loss to biodiversity. So how do you like that? Interconnection between trophic levels and dominant species and keystone species, and it's all related in the community. And so I hope you enjoyed that and the story of the toucan and the palm tree. Thanks for watching.